Back when I was a kid, the internet wasn't really readily available. I only got my own computer in 2007-2008, so if I wanted to find out about video game news and releases, the best I got was word of mouth or taking a gamble at a rental at the local Blockbuster. Remember those? This is probably why I missed out on so many games that are now considered classics. Believe it or not, the school I attended wasn't really into Persona or Kingdom Hearts. But another source of information was available, the video game magazines, but even back then I wasn't really a fan of them. They only ever released about once a month, and there was a baffling amount of choice. And even then my little kid brain knew that these magazines were biased, even if I didn't know what that word meant. As why would a Sony magazine review poorly a first-party exclusive? Lair haze anyone? And if you wanted to see console war threads in print form, look no further than the Q&A section of these magazines. If the writers couldn't slag off the other companies, their rabid fans could. I remember the main selling point for some of these magazines were the abundance of free stuff you got. Posters, stickers, other assortments of press release crap. Some even came with little cheat books, which were like magic back in the day, but then slowly phased out. Anyway, I didn't want to go on about magazines. No, I wanted to instead talk about something else. Magazine shows. Yes, if you couldn't afford multiple monthly magazines, the next best way for me to find out about gaming news were magazine shows, which took the format and content of print media and jazzed it up in a sexy and easy to digest way. A lot of these shows are nostalgic to me, and unless you lived in Britain, a lot of these will probably be alien to you. I know most of you Americans out there are familiar with stuff like G4 or whatever, but this is my childhood, damn it. We'll start our little jaunt through memory lane with the oldest show, Games Master. Not the oldest show with video games, others featured them as well, like the 1980s Micro Live, but many of those shows just had video games as a small feature during the booming personal computer market in Britain. Games Master was the most successful that had video games as the main focus. The show is a nostalgia trip, and if you live outside the UK, maybe a bit of a culture shock as you try to decipher the accents. The show is presented by Dominic Diamond and is perfect for this show. While you expect most presenters would be happy, eccentric, and intolerable, but Dominic is reserved and sarcastic, and watching today has a very how did they get away with saying that air to his presenting. The show is divided into segments and will usually begin with a challenge where two kids take on a challenge or go head to head. The winner would get a golden joystick and the loser would be escorted to their grave. But many times the challenges were brutal and all players would lose and get nothing. For me, the only enjoyment I get from this segment is yelling at the kids for being shit at the game. Then there is a short section about the latest in video game news, but would sometimes talk about the latest blockbuster, which is fun and nostalgic. Afterwards we have the review segment, where 3 games are reviewed by 3 different people and an arbitrary score is awarded. It's weird to see how little video games reviews have changed since back then. Next up is another challenge with celebrities, or whoever vaguely well-known person they could get at the time. The challenges would either be a celebrity facing a small child, or celebrities infighting. If you thought children being bad at video games was hard to watch, try watching people who have next to no experience attempt the same feat. Fortunately, the challenges are edited down extensively, so they fly by. Now the segment the show gets its namesake, the consultation, where 3 kids in extreme close-up ask the Game Master for advice and cheat codes. I love the design of the Game Master. It looks so bad, but it's awesome. I think what they tried to do is give him a big cranium to make him look smart, but they couldn't figure out how to do that, so they just angled the image down. This was probably a valuable segment back in the day, pre-internet, but the chance that the advice could be useful to you is pretty low. And finally, we have the featured segment, which would focus on a specific video game. As each season would go on, the show would be set in different locations with a sort of meta-narrative, with the ending of the second season taking place on an oil rig, and on the final episode the oil rig exploded with only Dominic escaping in a helicopter. Now, I mentioned earlier how much I love Dominic Diamond here, and he 100% makes the show, with most segments being real dull if it weren't for his wit, and how he likes to make fun of the kids. Unfortunately, the third season had a different host, and the absence of Diamond really shows as it's a real slog. Dominic would come back for the remainder of the seasons, and it seems like he's making up for lost time, being relentless when it came to making fun of the children.
As well, what sort of bands do you like?
I mean, the Nirvana.
Nirvana. Can you sing at all, Tom?
No, not really.
Because they're looking for a lead singer now, aren't they? Nirvana, you never know.
Holy shit, Dominic, chill out. At least wait until Kurt's body's cold. He died that year. Games Master is the benchmark when it comes to video game shows. Whilst it does have a greater focus on spectacle and challenges than actual video game information, if I wanted to know about a video game, I'd just go on Metacritic or something. And watching the show 25 years into the future, I enjoy the wave of nostalgia, even though the pacing of the show means the only thought I can have is, oh, I remember that game. So I totally recommend Games Master, and I would recommend a season that you're familiar with, where you knew what games came out that year. Gamer TV was the show I watched most in my childhood, and while most shows thought they had to rely on a gimmick or different kind of segments, Gamer TV foregoed all of those, even doing away with the host instead just having a disembodied voice. For a brief period they had him on camera, but that was swiftly changed. Just reviews, previews, and occasional interviews. All the views you could have wanted. It was here that I discovered some of my delights such as Chaos Legion and Stuntman. While I did like the straightforwardness of the show, the lack of any gimmick makes the show not stand out in my mind, and apart from the games I found out about, there was nothing I feel attached about or recall when I think of the show. I remember the logo, the score counter, and the Wizzy intro at the beginning, but that's because that was original for the show. The rest of the show was just gameplay, but I really appreciate that. Hindsight is 20/20, and it is fun looking back on the show when you know how certain events happened, like when they would talk about the endgame in a sort of optimistic manner. Even though the host has a relaxed tone when it comes to his narration, that didn't stop the show from having some hot takes, such as giving Pokemon Fire Red 2 stars, and it only got an extra star because it came with a wireless link cable.
Nintendo is releasing 2 new Pokemon games for the Game Boy Advance, and this is one of them, Pokemon Fire Red. Of course, collecting Pokemon is the aim of the game here, but as with the original Pokemon Red and Yellow, Nintendo haven't missed a trick and are releasing another game, Leaf Green, and you can't collect all the Pokemon until you have both games. Rip off. We're going to give Fire Red 2 stars, and that's only because it comes with a snazzy wireless link-up adapter.
Or not knowing what Dixie's name was, or shitting on Fire Emblem. I also can't get over the odd accents and voices they give Japanese devs.
Pro gamers don't sleep much, only about 3 to 4 hours, and most of them don't have girlfriends.
And so while it may have been to its detriment, especially when trying to find footage of the show, isn't that right, Ethan? Gamer TV was probably the best show, and probably the best show we will ever have. If only just because of its simplicity. So, Gamepad 4 was another video game related show which aired on the same channel as Gamer TV and would often air immediately after. Now, call me crazy, but I think that putting resources towards 2 shows that are almost identical is a bit pointless, but what do I know? Anyway, so Gamepad 4 is similar to Gamer TV, has the same format of having reviews, previews and short features that focus on specific subject, however the show differs in that it features a host, a Miss Violet Berlin. And credit to the show, Violet is knowledgeable about video games and has appeared in other shows about video games. Now, if you listen to other people, my taste in women is apparently garbage, but since I locked them in the basement, I don't hear them anymore. Anyway, I think Violet Berlin is supposed to be eye candy, but I never saw her like that. She's a cool, tomboyish type, but she's often in these awkward poses, like laying on the couch and such. I get what they were trying to do, sex up their program with Miss Berlin, but I'm not buying it. But some people on this forum post from 2009 seem to have different opinions. Violet Berlin, the joys of the older woman. I really want to do her. I think it's some sort of Freud thing. Her tits are massive. Oh wow, they really are the same person. Nice big melons, but not for me, I'm afraid. Maybe a soapy at a push? What the fuck? Now I know what you're thinking. Mitch, what would a cool hit version of Game Master set in the early 2000s look like? Well, it would look like Gamesville. A show with more hair gel than an episode of Raw from the Attitude Era. The format is almost identical to Games Master, with challenges and reviews from people who are out of touch. So much so that the creators of Game Master had some pretty hot takes, but I can see where they are coming from. Gamesville is incredibly out of touch and isn't appealing in the slightest. For one, the show is incredibly childish, with 2 hosts trying to be hip by gurning at the camera and being unlikable. Whenever they're in a segment with the rest of the crew, it reminds me of scenes from The Office where Tim stares at the camera with a face that can only mean, help me, it's really cringy. And even if the show is aimed at teenagers, even young ones, it's incredibly pandering and insincere about it. It reminds me of when Yogi Bear tried to reinvent himself by being a skateboarding 80s bear. And the show looked incredibly cheap, with it all being set in one location and going as far as reviewing not only shitty mobile phone games, but shitty Flash games on the internet. So the only reason to have a look at this show these days is for nostalgia about the games they were talking about. Even though you would have to filter through an unbearable amount of fluff in order to find anything of value. But there is one thing I liked about Gamesville that many people didn't. The Games Guru, a complete rip-off of the Games Master, but instead of teleporting kids into the cyber realm, kids send in their questions via mobile phone because it's hip, yo! The Games Guru was fun to watch, and again, if you're a kid like me who couldn't get on the internet for tips on cell damage, it was pretty useful. I also liked the way he delivered the tips like his head was gonna blow up. In 2004, Dominic Diamond of Games Master fame would come back to Teleland once more for a brand new video game show, When Games Attack. The format of the show is unfortunately structured to its own detriment in my opinion. It focuses on lots of small segments, and then adds a few more to try and get them all in a show that lasts 26 minutes. Now each segment were regular, so I guess I should just run down each segment. So the show is a lot more laddish, if that's a word, focusing on football and page 3 models jumping around on DDR pads, and putting down most things Japanese. In fact, the first segment of the first show was dedicated to shitting on Japanese games, and not just easy targets like Rayplay and the like, but shitting on the idea of giant transforming robots, and why would anyone be into that?
Well, quite frankly, we're sick of this whole giant transforming robot genre, which seems to be ludicrously popular in Japan for reasons unknown to us. The problem is the robots are just dull, and we'd rather watch a bunch of old men fighting outside a pub, which I'm gonna do right now.
Anyway, the show would start with Dominic being in a different location, and he'll read a viewer letter and give a sarcastic answer. Not sure if these are a sly wink to the stupid questions that would be brought up in Games Master or not. After that, we'll get to a top 5 about a subject, and the entrance would be sprinkled out about the show. Next, there would be a spotlight on a classic game with interviews from the devs. This is the only part of the show that pretends to be legitimate, and I wouldn't be surprised if this was part of a new show and was stapled onto this one. Next would be a tournament between celebrities in a contest of 2 video games. The first is a bunch of footballers from the Premier and Champions League, and yeah, I have never heard of most of them either. So they are in a Pro Evolution tournament, and it's about as pointless as actual football. The other competition, as mentioned earlier, is some page 3 models bouncing about on a DDR machine. Now, I'm no prude, but I can't help but get peeved about the hypocrisy of the show, decrying the sexuality of Japanese games, and then having a segment with a hot blonde is jumping around while a camera tries to get panty shots. Shoutouts to the girls though for being good sports and bucking trends by being well spoken and actually good at video games, almost like they're actual people! The next segment is a head-to-head where I will try to explain in a concise sentence. So, 2 hand puppets take 2 video games that have some things in common and pit the 2 against each other via graphics, gameplay, and replayability. The loser puppet would have to face a forfeit. The unfairness we have on display here is pretty funny. Having 2 games that only share a genre and then picking holes until one is victorious is pretty funny. Welcome to the universe where Unreal Tournament is way better than Counter-Strike. The final segment would flip-flop every week like the video games tournament. It would either be a segment that could be about a video game, but because of the nature of the show, they couldn't get any big games, so expect to see stuff like The Getaway or the JFK assassination game. Or it could be a theme park ride, or a real-life dogfight. The other segment was a Japan Spotlight, where Carolyn Flack would visit Japan and highlight otaku culture with the searing cynicism similar to the BBC. This was where I was first exposed to stuff like cosplay and the FGC. Now, while I may have been a bit snide about the show, I did, and still do, enjoy this show as a product of its time, and with all the different segments and Dominic Diamond back, it does have more personality than the other 900 shows that were on that channel, so it did stand out. And with all the different segments, if you didn't like one, the other 20 might have tingled your tangles. So for the whole of this video, I've been talking about shows that span multiple seasons or are really hard to find. Well, what if you only have a limited amount of time, say 50 minutes, and want something that's entertaining and easily digested? Allow me to introduce you to Charlie Brooker's GameSwipe. Yes, before Charlie was making shows where your mum would run on batteries, aka Black Mirror, he was making snarky programs about the world of television entitled Screenwipe, where he would deconstruct the inner workings of television and offer his thoughts on current shows and adverts. He also did a one-off special, GameSwipe. So Charlie has always been a pro-gaming personality, which is rare for someone on television, and doubly rare for someone employed by the BBC. In his previous shows, Screenwipe, he would constantly be giving little pleas that instead of watching television, you should be playing video games instead. and even had a debate with a haunted painting lookalike Jon Snow on the merits of video games.
It's violent and horrid.
What's violent about that?
I've just seen somebody blown to pieces.
You haven't seen somebody
I did.
Where?
In outer space.
What is your obsession with the violence in these games? These are pieces of Lego.
Something terrible is going to happen here.
No, I'm sorry to break it to you, but these are not real people. These are not human beings.
You think a
looking at.
child doesn't think those are real people?
I think a child thinks those are pieces of Lego. What did you do with pieces of Lego when you were a child? I'll tell you what I did.
I didn't send them into outer space and destroy them.
Well, I had space Lego and I did. How do you eject? Someone show me how you eject the disc!
So anyway, Games Wipe is a short, hour-long special shot in the style of Screen Wipe, but with video games as the subject. Charlie starts by talking about the history of programs about video games, like he was trying to invalidate this video 10 years before I wrote it, the prick. Throughout the show, little explanations of video game genres appear so that people who have no understanding of video games can follow along, but I don't see why someone who has no interest in video games would be watching a program about them. I guess we've got to fill time. The show also has short reviews, or I guess impressions, about current video games from Charlie. And in hindsight, the selection he chose to talk about were a bit bizarre, like Wolfenstein and 50 Cent Blood on the Sand. I guess I can rationalise talking about Wolfenstein as a point of comparison to the first FPS game and seeing how it has evolved for today's modern tastes. But 50 Cent? I don't know, maybe Charlie just had an axe to grind with him. The final recurring segment are little interviews with celebrities who apparently play video games. Some of them are okay, I enjoyed listening to the Consolvania guys, but that's really about it. Dara O'Brien talks about how video games lock content behind skill barriers, and the examples he gives are, I hope, meant to be jokes. To Rebecca Hughes, who I'm sure still works for the Escapist magazine, where she complains about Madwell because I guess she was expecting a video game equivalent to Gary Jules' song. But by far the worst is Gary Lineker. You may have heard of him as he's been in the news recently for helping fund a lot of money for a trans charity. In the interview he explains that GTA is terrible because it feels like a video game and not like a movie.
That feeling of people jumping out of the way suddenly made you feel like you were actually in a good film. Whereas Grand Theft Auto makes you feel like you're in a game.
Honestly, a lot of this special is skippable, only just because of these interviews. But Charlie himself has segments of his own where he talks about the media's scrutination of video games throughout history, and the hysteria certain titles have caused, taking us through the early 80s to present day, for the show at least. It helps put a lot of stuff today into perspective, that for as long as video games have been around, they have always faced criticism, but they've soldiered on anyway. And Charlie presents the show with great love and respect for video games without being afraid to call out the missteps. It's fun to watch and listen to Charlie. I recommend going to watch Screen Wipe and the other spin-offs that Charlie did, as they're all that good. And now we come to the last and most recent show to be released, Dara O'Brien's Let's Go 8-Bit. A show that has years of previous history of other successful shows and past mistakes to draw and take inspiration from. With a large celebrity name attached and with technology being at a high standard, this would surely be the greatest show about video games to ever grace the tiny screen. Well, it's not. It fucking sucks. Let's Go 8-Bit takes the awful, gurning atmosphere of Gainesville and combines it with the inept challenges that Games Master had. Only now we have two new elements to add to the mix, a live studio audience and contempt. Contempt is in, oh look at these video games, aren't they just quaint? We're grown adults, and yet here we are exercising the mere thought that these video games might be entertaining.
April 3, which sees the return of original heroine Jill Valentine. She's an ass-kicking, lock-picking marvel, although it's hard to have total respect for someone who thinks the most practical outfit for killing zombies in is a boob tube. What's wrong with a nice warm jumper, Jill?
Yes, Jill, you silly cow. Don't you realise we judge people here based on what they're wearing and not the actions they've performed? The show is headed by Dara, Video Games Should Let Me Skip Content Bria, who gives 5 challenges to 2 teams, who then awkwardly play video games until one of them is decided the winner. We also have our Games Master equivalent, Ellie Gibson, who I guess is supposed to be like the guy from Pointless. So the 2 teams are broken up into one team captain, who stays for each episode, and then each team has a celebrity guest. So it's almost exactly the same as Games Master's Celebrity Challenges then. So the appeal of the show is not so much watching the games be played well, it's more trying to watch the celebrities play the game poorly. The baffling thing is the second and third challenges allow the celebrity to pick their favourite game for the challenges. And you know what? They're still awful at it. The fourth round will typically be a modern game, and if the celebrities had trouble before, try giving them a controller with 2 analog sticks. The final challenge would typically be some extravagant recreation of a popular video game. We can't just watch 2 people play Tetris or, God forbid, play it well. No, that would be too boring. Instead, why don't we hook up the machine to some third-party DDR pads that drop inputs? Now that's entertainment! Now with this being a game show with challenges and 2 teams, the simple scoring system would be if you win a challenge, that team gets a point. But that's far too simple, and as we saw from the final challenge, making everything complicated is the key to entertainment. So the way the scoring works is the audience gets to vote on what team they think will win. The percentage of the audience vote is tallied, and the highest percentage is the score that would be given. As in to say, there are 100 people in the audience. 78 of them vote for Team A to win, so 78 points would be the prize. Did you get that? So then surely, if one of the celebrities shows they are capable of pushing buttons without having to look at the controller, and then the audience votes for them to win in a huge majority, and then they do win, that's easy points for that team. Maybe I'm taking the scoring system too seriously when this show is clearly a joke. Remember that Mitchell and Webb sketch, Number Wang, where none of the rules make sense and things just happen? You just sit back and watch the chaotic mess? Yeah, it's like that. I mean, I guess it's not too bad. The show doesn't go full parody by having something like a pointless set that rotates. Oh. The final thoughts on this show is that it's the absolute worst. People with no respect for games playing them poorly in front of an audience of people who know nothing about them. The show actually had a sister show where they removed the challenges and would just talk about games, but if I wanted to hear opinions about games from people who clearly have contempt for them, I would just go somewhere like Eurogamer. Oh hey, look at that! Now the only thing that brings me the smug satisfaction is knowing that the show got cancelled. So that was my super long and pointless retrospective of video game programs from England. I think each of them is interesting to go back and watch as like their own little time capsules. Not just from the games on display, but the attitudes, production values, and how the video games were treated in the show. Now with the internet and video game shows being made by actual fans are about, it's less likely that video games will come back to the same screen you play them on. But with Let's Go 8-Bit, even though I think it's an awful show, there is still a chance a show like that could happen. Although I think it would be pretty hard to make a show that I would consider perfect. I mean, they would need to have the focus be on the game and not just superfluous fluff. They would need other segments to break up the game footage and take a breather. Respect for the games being played, as well as a fun atmosphere and a charismatic host. Now, where on earth could we find a show like that?
My name is Arino the Kacho, and I am the Retro Game Master. As you may already know, the Retro Game Master is the hottest TV show in Japan now.